I think we're going to head to Uganda, Eastern Africa. Second day of the Uganda Development Summit coming to an end in Kampala. It was hosted by the Uganda Development Bank. An inaugural summit has brought together leading figures in Africa and global development finance for high-level discussions on unlocking investment opportunities. Now, the event has featured strategic dialogue between public, private sector stakeholders, showcased flagship projects, and highlighted Uganda's potential as a rising regional economic hub and a great place for tourism. Here are some excerpts from today's session.
We're in turbulent times as far as trade and trade policy is concerned. But for Africa, at least there are some bright spots. Let's go over them because I think much of the message is going to be depressing, but at least let's look at the bright spots. IMF says Africa average growth for 2026 will be about 4.6%. That's average. I know in Uganda you're expecting more. The growth is driven mainly by demographic shifts, domestic consumption. I think this point is really very important, and it's something I'll come back to when we talk about intra-African trade. But it's also reflected in the fact that intra-African trade is also growing. And here, the Afreximbank report, which just came out, does posit a 12.4% intra-Africa trade increase over 2023-2024 to reach 220 billion. And then if you look at other data sources, they're saying the same thing. The UN Comtrade data that is led by UNCTAD says that in 2024 there was an 8.5% growth in intra-African trade, and they compare this to 0.4% growth in Africa's exports to the rest of the world, and then also the growth in world exports. Next slide. But also we are in a state of global uncertainty, and I don't want to dwell too much on this, but you know, the poly crisis, as we all are aware, the global economy is only growing less than what we see for the African economy on average, and the tariff hikes led by the US is creating a lot of uncertainty. And some say that although markets seem to be calm, the stock markets, global stock markets, bond markets, that this might be the calm before the storm, that there might still be a very strong adverse market reaction to what we are seeing. But all the same, you know, these are some key trends. I'll just also highlight the issue around climate change and sustainability, which came out very strongly yesterday, especially in Professor Akebe's intervention. Because clearly our future is sustainability. We have to adapt our production processes in that direction. And then also just to mention that the neoliberal consensus, which was also mentioned yesterday, has collapsed. And with it is what was the understanding that developing countries should have special treatment, including aid flows. All of this also came out yesterday. Very quickly, these are the initial tariff hikes for African countries with the very famous 50% increase for Lesotho. As you know, the next slide actually will point this out. There's no basis for these tariff increases. They were done in a haphazard way. No serious trade economist would calculate tariff on the basis of just reciprocal differences in trade flows, because that's not the way it's done. But anyway, this was what came out initially. And in the next slide, I try to explain what actually is being going on in terms of the thinking and the instruments that are being used and so on. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but just simply to make the point that, of course, the Trump tariffs are still being contested in the courts, as you know. We don't actually know what might be the final outcome in all of this. But all the same, this does mean that African countries, which, except for a few that have been exposed to the tariff hikes, just because the trade flows to the U.S. were relatively low, even with AGOA. A few countries stood out, like Lesotho, Madagascar, Mauritius, Kenya, etc. But the key point is that as Africans, we're yet to come together to see how to negotiate and navigate this new reality that is unfolding. And I'll move on to the next point, the next slide. I also wanted to just highlight that it's not just the US that has been using market power to drive its own trade policy priorities. The EU has been doing the same, except of course that the EU does these things in a much more refined way. But basically the EU has a number of instruments that are related to its Green Deal, its emphasis on sustainability, and the constituency that is behind that, because there's a very strong European constituency that supports measures to prevent climate change and so on. But just to highlight that these unilateral measures taken by the EU also impact Africa's trade with the EU. In the case of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, a study that I was involved in shows that the hit to African countries is about 0.2% of GDP every year. But just to make that point, that as part of this transition that's going on, we're also seeing unilateral measures, which can be compared to the kind of unilateral measures that the US has also been taking. Next slide. My key argument here is trade flows matter for Africa's development. I always say that Africa has no plan B. There's only one plan A, and that plan A is trade, and I'll explain. Next slide. Trade, and this is why it's important for trade to be coordinated with finance, to be coordinated with foreign affairs, etc. Trade flows was beyond just the monetary flows. The trade flows include the technology, the know-how, the productivity, the scale, the competitiveness that drives investment, finance, and the connection here, and development. Businesses that trade more likely to be competitive, offer higher wages, create formal sector employment, and pay taxes. Trade is the key to unlocking development finance, managing debt, building institutions, maintaining the social contract between government and its people for spending on social policy, health, education, etc.